As discussions continue heating up between Moscow and Washington over ending the Russia-Ukraine war, a gap is starting to emerge in how the parties see this war ending. What is the vision for Russia? What is the vision for the United States? What is the vision for Europe? And what is the vision for Ukraine and President Zelensky? Those things will eventually all have to be brought into concert and into an agreement of some sort if this war is ever going to come to an end. And obviously, that's the whole point of negotiations, just to try and minimize the difficulties, bring the sides together until they can come up to one final agreement. But the problem that we have right here is that, number one, time is not on the Ukraine side. And then number two, the viewpoints of even the three on the alleged same side with Russia and with the United States, Ukraine, and the European Union themselves seem to be very, very divergent. And it's very difficult to see how we're going to get into this very quickly. To try and help us understand some of the difficulties and some of the different viewpoints, we have Colonel Jacques Baud back on, retired former Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service and former NATO officer, and just one of the smartest guys in Europe I've ever seen. So, Colonel, first of all, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you for having me back to the show.
Always love to have you on with your perspective, because you have both the military perspective, you have the experience of understanding how a lot of these people think militarily in Europe and especially in the Russia, since you had a lot to do with that during your NATO days. But just also from your historian perspective, and the fact you've written so many books, you just really study this stuff more than nearly anybody I know. So we're really grateful to have you on. I want to start off by taking a look at, first of all, from the Russian side and some of the statements that they've been making to see if we can start piecing together just where the parties really are and how far the gaps are. And then lastly, we'll want to talk about what possibilities could we have to reduce some of the gaps between the various sides in order to reach an end. So here, first of all, is Sergei Lavrov really arguing that Europe seems to be more interested in perpetuating the war than in ending it.
President Trump, when this topic was brought up at the press conference, said that the decision to deploy peacekeeping forces is possible only with the consent of both sides, apparently referring to us and Ukraine. No one is asking us about this. The approach being imposed by the Europeans, primarily France, as well as the British, is once again aimed at heating up the conflict further while suppressing any attempts to calm it down.
So what do you make about that? Let's start with the last part of his statement there first, that it seems like the Europeans, they just want to keep the thing going. They don't want to calm it down.
Well, that in fact is very much what is about France, because France is just coming back with an idea it had already 1 year ago, almost exactly 1 year ago, that the NATO even was opposed to, and even the US at that time. So they're coming back with this idea of bringing troops as so-called peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, on the theater. Now, the important thing here, and I think Lavrov is mentioning that if you want to have peacekeepers, that means basically, as the name says, they are here to maintain or to keep the peace, meaning that you need first to have an agreement, a peace agreement. And I used to be head of the policy and doctrine of in the Office of Military Affairs of the United Nations for peacekeeping operations. So probably it's very useful to show here a chart that explains a little bit how does it work to mandate peacekeeping forces. It's not just countries sending troops on a theater. Basically, you need to have a mandate. And we have here, obviously, UN mandate. We'll probably can forget for the sake of this discussion the mandate of the African Union, which, by the way, is connected to a mandate given by the UN Security Council. But you see that whoever executes the peacekeeping mandates, it's always under a UN mandate. That's what you have, for instance, NATO in Kosovo, or European Union in Chad or Niger, even in this so-called hybrid operation between African Union and the UN, you need to have a UN mandate. So meaning that you're not just sending troops just like this. It needs to be accepted by both parties, and that's in essence what the UN mandate. Here you may have a bilateral mandate. That's what you have in the Sinai, the so-called multinational force and observers, which is a bilateral mandate given by Israel and Egypt to the US. And that's a peacekeeping force, in fact, which is deployed in the Sinai. It's a very small one, but that's a bilateral mandate. It's quite an exception. But again, it's a bilateral mandate. That means that both parties, in that case Egypt and Israel, have agreed to have a peacekeeping operation. This operation can be under Chapter 6, which is basically maintaining the peace, or under Chapter 7, which is in essence, without going into all the details, it's about enforcing peace. And now, here there is a difference between peace enforcement and peacekeeping. When you make peacekeeping, then you keep the peace, as I said. When you want to enforce the peace, that means that you don't have a peace agreement yet, or not fully implemented, and you force the parties to implementing the deal, or you force them to the negotiation table. And in essence, what Macron and Keir Starmer, in fact, are proposing at this stage is, in fact, closer to the peace enforcement, which is, in fact, a combat operation, than keeping the peace. And that's why, however you see the problem, it will always come back to the point that without the approval of the Russians, you will have no troops or no peacekeepers on the ground. You may have peace enforcers, but then we are in a combat situation. And in that situation, as the Russians have already said many times, if they have forces that they have not accepted, they consider them as enemy or combatant units, and they will destroy them. So that's, in a nutshell, what we are facing with the Macron's proposal. In fact, it's not a peace proposal at all. It's just, as Lavrov rightly said, it's another way of extending the war without saying it, under the guise of peacekeeping. But again,
he said a little bit more on this ceasefire and the peacekeepers, which I think is also illustrative of where the Russian mind is on this.
Macron stated in Washington about the need for an urgent ceasefire and the deployment of peacekeeping forces. Then, supposedly, we will talk about territories, the fate of people, and other principles of settlement. One cannot agree to a deal aimed solely at one goal, once again pumping Ukraine full of weapons.
Now, Lavrov had said in other interviews on this specific issue, he says, we're not interested in having a negotiated settlement that only stops this, a ceasefire and then puts peacekeepers troops, then to only after that talk about the terms that the ultimate would be settled on, because he said that's what we did with Minsk. We basically had a ceasefire and this line of contact, and then we said we'll implement these other things. And so they have said that, at least previously, and like in the last few days, that we're not going to do that this time. We will only stop fighting once an agreement has been reached. Otherwise, we're going to keep going. Do you think he means that, or is that just negotiating space?
No, I think it is a valid point, because so far the Russians have always been framed by the French in particular, because remember that the Minsk agreements were basically guaranteed by both the French and the Germans, and both France and Germany didn't, in fact, respect their signature, and instead of guaranteeing or pressing Kiev into the agreement, they just let Kiev rearming. And as François Hollande later said, as well as Angela Merkel, in fact, they misused this agreement to allow Kiev to rearm and to prepare for the war that, in fact, was being launched, or the operation that was about to be launched in February 22 by the Ukrainians. So that's an experience the Russians don't want to repeat. And I give some right on that. They want to have a lasting agreement and no ceasefire, which is, in a certain sense, which is a problem, because on the other side, if you look at the Ukrainians, they said, well, we cannot have elections under the martial law. But in order to lift the martial law, they need to have some kind of pause in the war, probably. And that's so that they can have the election, because as the US and Russians discussed in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, the idea is that the election process in Ukraine should be part of the peace process, because for many reasons, some legal reason that otherwise, how can we trust an agreement which is signed by a president which is not fully validated by elections? Therefore, the election process must be part of the peace process. But on the other hand, if Ukraine has to organize elections, it has to lift the martial law for that, because that's a constitutional obligation. And it probably will be reluctant to do that if there is some kind of ceasefire. So I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I understand the position of the Russians. This is a position that makes a lot of sense because of the past experience. On the other hand, we have here a situation that if there are no pause in the battle, it will be hard to justify an election process in Ukraine. I don't know exactly if the Ukrainians on their side or the Russians have thought about this. I have no answer to that. It's a legal, political issue, but I think it's an important issue.
So we've talked there a little bit about what the Russian view on that is, and we've indirectly heard about what the European side is on that. Here's what Trump said on that topic. Or at least I think it's going to be. Okay, I guess I jumped the gun there on Gary. Sorry to throw you a curveball there.
You want him talking about the American being in Ukraine?
I thought you just sent me a text on that.
Yeah, that's good. Just making sure. Sure.
I'm not going to make security guarantees beyond very much. We're going to have Europe do that, because it's we're talking about Europe as their next door neighbor. But we're going to make sure everything goes well. And as you know, we'll be really partnering with Ukraine in terms of rare earth. We very much need rare earth. They have great rare earth. It brings us great wealth. We get back the money that we spent, and we hope that we're going to be able to settle this up. And we'll be working with Ukraine, and because we'll be taking that, we're going to be taking what we're entitled to take. It's a great deal for Ukraine, too, because they get us over there, and we're going to be working over there. We'll be on the land, and in that way, there's sort of automatic security, because nobody's going to be messing around with our people when we're there, and so we'll be there in that way.
So, whereas Lavrov's focused on getting an enduring, sustainable end to this, the Europeans seem to be focused on trying to come out in some kind of a strong position. Trump seems to be like saying, yeah, I want the war to be over, but I'm really focused on getting some of these rare earths. So you see, yet another discrepancy between how the parties are entering into these negotiations. What do you take away from the American side here?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not sure. I'm sure Trump is not a pacifist, first of all. And he wants to get rid of this conflict because he sees the Ukraine conflict as a liability for the US. And for that reason, he wants to be disengaged from that. That's the main point. Now, related to that, he wants, because he said that many times, by the way, he spent US, I mean, according to him, US spent too much money on that conflict, and therefore he wants to recover some the funds that US provided to Ukraine. And we have to remember that it's Zelensky who came first with this idea. Zelensky came to this idea because he realized that Trump is more in a kind of trade type of thinking. And therefore, Zelensky thought that Trump would be willing to help Ukraine further in the future if Trump finds a return on investment, if you want. The problem is that apparently Trump said, okay, rare earth in terms of return on investment, that's fine, but not for the future, but for the investment we have already done in the past. And that's where we have a discrepancy between what Zelensky had first in mind and what Trump has in mind. And that's the reason why we had this kind of go, no go issue with Zelensky, because the deal that has been or will be signed shortly between Ukraine, between Zelensky and Trump, is not what Zelensky wanted. He wanted a commitment of Trump for the future. That's a very important thing to understand, I think. Now, the situation is as it is. Probably Zelensky thought that it's probably better to have the US on his side, and even if it's not for the future, but for past investment provided by the US. So I think that's the main thing. Now, this agreement, and I have seen the agreement, it was published on the Ukrainian site, doesn't include any security guarantee.
Right.
And that's an important point, because in fact, the reason for Zelensky to have this bound with US was because of I would say, the protection that US would offer, implicitly or explicitly. That's the reason why Zelensky is so keen to have an agreement with the US. Problem is that, as the previous administration said, and this one also, the US doesn't want to be involved on a theater of operation where the risk is that they come into direct confrontation to Russia. And that is something that Zelensky has not understood at all.
Or hasn't been willing to understand.
Willing to understand. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, we have to remember that as it comes to security arrangement or security guarantees, Ukraine has signed about 28 agreements, bilateral agreements, with individual European states for security guarantees. So that means that there are other tools, and it appeared also last year, by the way, that NATO is not suited for this kind of commitment. US doesn't want to be directly confronting Russia. So the bilateral agreement with individual states is the only option open for Zelensky at this stage.
Yeah, and it seems pretty clear that Zelensky is not yet come to the mental understanding that the war is over and that he's negotiating an end that's not going to be on favorable terms to him under any conditions. He's still looking for those favorable terms and to avoid what's coming. And that's also part of the problem with reaching a settlement that everyone can live with, that certainly everyone's not going to agree to it. But I want to move on to like some of the specific divergences between Russia and the European Union. Lavrov in this next clip here was talking about the just completed meeting that was in Kiev. I believe it was on the 24th, where a lot of senior European leaders were met, and we're talking about things that they're going to do with Kiev. Here's how Lavrov viewed that meeting.
On February 24th of this year, a large delegation from Europe already visited Ukraine and once again announced multi-billion-dollar arms deliveries. When the United States submits a resolution calling for an urgent transition to peace, Europe votes against it. Then, through their actions, they confirmed that they do not want peace at all because their clients have not yet completed their main tasks. Although these tasks keep changing, not long ago, it was about delivering a strategic defeat to Russia, something that the European Union and NATO repeated daily like a mantra. Now, in Washington, Macron said that a settlement must be reached that does not look like a capitulation.
So how do you reconcile that? Well, this, first of all, just look at from the European side. They did. I mean, and we've shown here recently, United States especially set an outright objective for the war support to weaken Russia and to harm them. And he was right. That was repeated often. Now then you have Macron and Keir Starmer maybe not using exactly that same language. Maybe they've given up on that, but they still want to have things in place that are going to be negative from the Russian perspective. But I think we were talking about this a little bit at the beginning of the show. Is Russia in a position to where it has to concede points that the European Union wants?
Well, the problem is that the European Union has never really defined exactly what it wants. Meaning, weakening Russia is one thing. Having winning Ukraine or having defeated Russia. How do you define defeat for Russia? How do you define winning Ukraine? What does it mean? A victory for Ukraine, for instance. And then you have those very contradictory and paradoxical expression, as Mark Rutte recently said, that Ukraine has to prevail, but now the front line is moving in the wrong direction. So you see that even the Europeans themselves, they don't know exactly what they expect from this conflict. Zelensky, as he proposed his victory plan last year, that was totally delusional. But in a certain sense, there was some kind of consistent thinking in that. Delusional, but consistent, in the sense that he said, what I want is Russia out of the border of Ukraine. I mean, the 1991 or 2014, 1991 borders. And that's it. Okay, that is consistent. It's not consistent with the reality on the ground, but it's clear at least. And today, I think the Europeans realize that this is not achievable, that Ukraine has not the means to do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't provide additional ammunition and equipment to Ukraine. They understand that Ukraine has a personnel problem. So they know that it is totally unachievable to recover all the territory that Zelensky is claiming. But they want to continue. And that's, here we are in this, exactly what we have mentioned several times, I think, on your show also, that they want to fight Russia up to the last Ukrainian. And that's exactly what the impression I have, because, and that makes also Zelensky very unpopular in Ukraine itself, which is another issue. But the Europeans on that topic are totally delusional, and in fact, they don't have any real objective or policy. And that, in fact, is something we have seen And that's the reason why, by the way, Trump doesn't want them into the negotiation for peace, because they see that they don't even have an idea of how to solve the problem. They just want to continue the problem, but they don't have a plan, an idea, a proposal, an alternative plan or whatever to solve the question. They don't want to solve it. They just want to achieve their own objective, which is weakening Russia. And that's,
I think that was really illustrated with the Lithuanian foreign minister, who at that very meeting that Lavrov was talking about was obviously, she understands that Trump has now said that we're not going to continue this war. We want it to be over with relatively soon. But they definitely have not come to grips with what's possible, because here's how she characterized and quantified what they would like to see as the end result.
So what Europe needs to do, first of all, support further Ukraine, buy Ukraine for Ukraine, develop joint projects, provide weaponry, remove any restrictions and limitations for the use of those weapons. Secondly, strengthen ourselves, expand our defense industry, expand our military capability. Third, what we need to do is also to ensure that transatlantic bond works. Even though we are now a bit dysfunctional family, divorce is not an option. And number 4, do not ever neglect international principles such as inviolability of borders or a right of every nation to choose defense alliance that it wants to be a part of.
So basically, her first point was essentially saying, no, we still want military capacity and the ability to keep shoveling in weapons and ammunition and whatever into whatever's left of Ukraine. And we still want to keep NATO on the table, with their point number 4, which were both categorically rejected by Russia and Sergei Lavrov there. How do you square those things?
Well, first of all, there's a contradiction. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Zelensky said he has a 1 million army. I'm not exactly sure how he comes to this figure, but that's the figure he announced. And today, the Europeans are saying they are providing new weapons. I repeat, the problem in Ukraine is not the number of weapons. It's probably, certainly now, it's a problem, a personnel issue, but it was not the problem of number of weapons. It's the problem is that the Ukrainian received so many equipment that were not integrated into proper command structures, that were not properly integrated into functional military structures. You had units with Leopard 2, with Leopard 1, with AMX-10 RC. All these weapons have totally different capabilities. So how can you have a consistent military doctrine, operational doctrine, I mean, to use those equipment efficiently? And that was the problem. In fact, the Europeans contributed significantly to the defeat of the Ukrainians, because the way they provide this equipment, just for the sake of putting new weapons on the battlefield. And today you have hundreds of thousands of weapons, I mean, I assume small arms and light weapons, who are missing on the battlefield, by the way. It comes into addition, but it's for another discussion.
Yeah.
So meaning that the problem was not the number of weapons. And the Europeans are sticking to this idea that the victory is related to the number of weapons they inject on the theater. That's the first mistake. The second mistake is that when they talk about the issue of international law and all that, they could have prevented that with the application or implementation of the Minsk agreements, which in fact was international law. And Lithuania, von der Leyen, they said they didn't want to implement that. So here also you have kind of inconsistency. They use international law as it suits their own policy to fight against Russia. But they never used the international law to protect Ukraine as it was the right time to do it. And I mean in 2021 and early 2022, they never did that. So this is this experiment. But again, you mentioned the person we have seen is the Minister of Lithuania. When you have Kaja Kallas, who used to come from Estonia, who is currently the responsible for the External Action Service of the European Union, all these people have this culture of being totally anti-Russian. So it's almost irrationally against Russia. Therefore, we are in Europe as we see it, and basically, if you hear Emmanuel Macron, if you hear Annalena Baerbock, if you hear Keir Starmer, they have the same kind of individuals. They are viscerally against Russia.
Well, and in fact, speaking of Keir Starmer, he's obviously in Washington right now. We're still waiting for some statements coming out of that, depending on whatever Trump and he came out with. But we do know what he said on Monday on the anniversary of the 3-year anniversary of this war, when he addressed that very grouping in Kiev that we were referring to. Here's how he put his view of how the war should end.
And ultimately, a US backstop will be vital to deter Russia from launching another invasion in just a few years' time. So we will do everything we can to get the best outcome for Ukraine and for us all. And let me close with one of the voices I mentioned earlier, a patient called Petro from the burns unit that I visited in Kyiv. He said to me, if Ukraine fails, Europe will be next. And that is what is at stake here. That is why we will always stand with Ukraine and with our allies against this aggression and for a just and lasting peace.
Yeah, I mean, that almost seems just contradictory within the confines of that one small little clip there. At the same time, you started by saying we're going to try to get the best outcome of negotiated settlement that we can get, but we're going to keep supporting you and we're going to keep resisting Russian aggression. How do those things coexist?
Well, that's part of this inconsistency of the Europeans at large. I mean, obviously, UK is not in the European Union, but at the same time, they have this similar understanding of the conflict, which is so biased that you can hardly understand how the intelligence work in those countries, because it doesn't make any sense. How come do they come to the conclusion that, for instance, Russia is preparing a new offensive against Europe, for instance? There was recently a report from the Danish intelligence saying that in a couple of years, Russia will be able to attack the whole of Europe. For what purpose? With what kind of objective? To achieve what? I mean, this is the kind of thing which disturbs me. My background, as you said in the introduction, is strategic intelligence. So the first thing you start to understand when you have a threat is, what do they want to achieve? What is their objective? How can I oppose this threat? And if I want to oppose it, I have first to identify what its objectives are. And here, what do they want? I mean, during the Cold War, we had the perception, which proved false, but that was the perception at the time, that the Soviets wanted to make the whole of the Western world like communist, or to expand Marxism and things like this. Okay. But at least that was an objective. It was the objective we perceived, but that was at least an objective. But today, what could be the objective? I mean, Russia is a country that works according to the same economic principles as ours. So it's not a Marxist state anymore. We don't see what would be the interest of Russia to rule Western Europe. I mean, to occupy the whole of Europe and ruling Europe. For what reason?
Right.
You
Right.
see, this is something which strikes me. How come nobody asks that? Even those who believe that Russia could attack Europe, nobody asks why.
Well, yeah, and I think that the reason is that because they don't need to ask that reason, because it's self-evident. Russia
Well,
is evil in their mind. So they're the evil empire. They still are. So you just have to, because they're evil. But that, of course, that just stops any kind of analysis that shows, okay, do they have the capacity to do that? How would they manage it? What would the occupation forces, what would they gain from it? What would the cost be? Of course, once that analysis is done, then immediately you say, well, they're not going to do that. Why would they do that?
well, the thing is that everything you said is, I think it's exactly how people think. But we depart from the idea that Vladimir Putin is irrational. But if we look at what's happened on the Ukrainian theater, and not even on this theater, but if we see how Russia worked in Syria, with Iran, in various areas on the political level, we can see that the Russians and Vladimir Putin and his team are extremely rational in their decision making. Everything they do is explicable. You can explain that. You can justify it. The problem is that we have distorted these the decision made by Vladimir Putin. For instance, the most famous one is probably that we decided that Vladimir Putin wanted to take Ukraine in 3 days, or take Kiev in 3 days. And he wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine. But in fact, I have never heard that from any Russian official at any point in the conflict, even before the conflict. So where did this idea come from? That he wanted to take over Kiev. In addition to that, the troops that were around Kiev in March 2022 that was 22,000 people. And in Kursk area, to take a small village like Sudzha with 6,000 people, the Ukrainians have deployed probably something like 50,000 people. So the Ukrainians have deployed twice the number, or more than twice the number that the Russians had to take over Kiev in March 2022. So it doesn't make any sense. See,
Yeah.
so
It does. I mean, I just think that just goes to show that there has been very little change in the mentality of anybody in Europe, at least. There's been a radical change in the White House just because we have a new person in charge in the White House.
Yes.
But in Europe, there's all the same people are still in charge, and it's just proven very, very difficult to change those viewpoints. So my last question that I have here for you is based on the still, I just think politely say, delusional view of Volodymyr Zelensky, what he wants. The European Union, or I say European Union, Europeans, NATO leaders, etc., they still want to have some kind of end that is pernicious and punitive to Russia. They don't want them to succeed. You have Trump talking about mineral deals, but he just wants the killing to be stopped. And then you have the Russian side with their views of 14 June 2024, etc. Those are all diametrically opposed and shoot in different directions. But in order for the war to come, everybody to some degree has to get to something that they can at least live with, or at least the United States, Russia, and Ukraine do. European Union, really, they can do kind of whatever they want to do. I suppose they don't have to come to an agreement, but the other ones do. Or, and this is my real question to you, can Russia just ignore everything and say, y'all can stay wherever you are? We're just going to keep rolling to the west until we've conquered everything we want.
Well, I think probably the Russians at this stage probably don't care. They are not those who are on the demand side. Remember that. They are not on the demanding side. The ones who are on the demanding side at this stage is, in fact, the US administration. These are the ones who want to have an agreement. They came up with this idea of having an agreement. And I think the Trump team has understood that having Zelensky in the discussion or the Europeans in the discussion will just bring chaos. Therefore, my understanding, probably I'm wrong, but that's my understanding, is that Donald Trump wants to come up with a solution agreed upon with the Russians and tell to the Ukraine, okay, that's the agreement, take it or leave it. If you leave it, we are out, we go, and bye-bye, you are on your own. And the Europeans, same thing. You know, the Europeans today, they say they have all these trying to portray themselves as strong and all that. But in reality, they don't have the industrial capacities to support the conflict. They don't have the finance to support the conflict. They don't even know exactly at one point they will stop supporting the conflict. They know that they will have to reconstruct Ukraine. So this will be trillions of euros. So at one point, the Europeans will have to come to the reality. And I think that's what the Trump administration is aiming at. From the
Russian it seems to me, I was going to say, for the Russian side, it appears to me that, and it's from some of the comments I just showed you there from Sergei Lavrov, some others that have been made by Vladimir Putin here in just the last few days, seem to indicate that because of the experience they had with Minsk agreements, and then the fact that this war came to a head at all, which, according to the Russian side, was because NATO was expanding and wouldn't stop, etc., that they now in the military driver's seat would say, all right, we're going to keep going until we can, of our own, not worrying about negotiated settlements or agreements or taking anybody's word, but till we can physically create on the ground what we consider is our security, and whatever that may mean for the people that are still in Kiev. It
Absolutely.
Seems to me that they're going to say, I'm not going to agree to anything less than my maximalist goals. Do you see it different?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with you. I mean, they now, as I said, they say, if you want an agreement, that's good for us. We are ready to take it. But we are not asking for it. And you are now losing. And we continue to fight. And in fact, the longer this will last, the less opportunities you will have for Ukraine to recover. Like, in fact, in reality, that will make the recovery of Ukraine more difficult. As a result, in reality, what the Europeans are doing is they are weakening Ukraine and not Russia. And this is what they haven't, or they don't want to realize. But they are weakening Ukraine. The Russians understand that. I think the Trump team understands that, at least partly. And this is the reason why, for the Russians, they don't really, as you said at the very beginning, time runs for them. I mean, they have time. The Ukrainians don't have time in reality. And that's what the Europeans have not realized so far. But they are, the European policy towards Ukraine is in fact slowly destroying Ukraine. And because, you have, of course, a destruction of the infrastructures and all that. But you have a lot of Ukrainians who at the same time have already left the country. They will not come back.
Yeah.
They said, I have a lot of people who follow the video I make in French and all that, and they follow me. And I have many Ukrainians here in Brussels that have stopped me on the street and thanked me for what I'm saying on the video. Because these people, they know they will not come back to Ukraine. They understand that the country is destroyed. They understand that the recovery will be extremely difficult. And they also understand that their generation, those who have escaped the fighting for good or bad reason, this generation is lost. You know, when you build up or you want to rebuild a country, you will have to rebuild on those forces, these active forces of the society, those people between 20 and 50 or 40 years of age. It is precisely the generation or the two generations that have been decimated by the war.
Right.
Meaning that, in fact, the more this conflict lasts, the longer the conflict lasts, the less opportunities for recovery, a rapid recovery you will have in the country. So Europe is in fact destroying the country today.
Yeah, that's the harsh reality of it. It's no one in the West wants to accept that, or at least not any of the mainstream sources, but the facts are what they are. And one of the reasons why we're so adamant on seeing this war come to a rapid end by whatever means we can get it done to stop the destruction of the Ukrainian future. But it's not in our power to do so. So we'll keep advocating for it and hoping sanity will return to enough of the people that it needs to get this war over with. But in any case, we really appreciate you, even if some of the things are unpleasant, we really appreciate you casting a light on this and showing just what's true and what's not.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me back.
And thank you guys for coming in today and watching. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.